You know, sometimes when you're just drifting off, your mind starts to wander. You might suddenly remember that peculiar conversation you had about why ancient Egyptians used crocodile dung as sunscreen. Yes, really, it's a thing. Or perhaps you recall a baffling historical mystery that's kept historians scratching their heads for centuries. Tonight, though, we're not going to dwell on the curious case of the pharaoh's skincare routine or forgotten empires. Instead, we are going to untangle a story woven into the very fabric of an island nation, a tale of warriors, honor, and profound change that still echoes in the modern world. You might think you know the samurai, those iconic figures in their elaborate armor, with their razor-sharp katana. But their story, and the story of feudal Japan, is far richer and more complex than any movie or manga could ever fully capture. It's a narrative filled with political intrigue, breathtaking battles, philosophical evolution, and even a few moments where you'll just have to shake your head and wonder, did that really happen? We're going to trace their journey from humble beginnings to their eventual, almost inevitable, fading into history, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere exotic, or even just your quiet bedroom down the street, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins long before the first samurai ever drew a sword. Back in the mists of time, when Japan was a land of countless small clans, each with its own local deity and its own sense of self-importance. Imagine a patchwork quilt of tribal communities scattered across an archipelago defined by volcanic mountains and a restless sea. You can almost feel the dampness in the air, the scent of pine and salt, as these early people navigate a landscape that is both beautiful and challenging. This was a time when myth and history were inextricably linked, where the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami was said to have birthed the imperial line, giving the nascent state a divine mandate that would endure for centuries. It's fascinating, isn't it, how so many cultures ground their authority in the heavens. As centuries passed, around the 3rd to 6th centuries CE, a powerful clan known as the Yamato clan began to assert its dominance. They weren't just flexing their muscles, they were also rather clever about it. They leveraged their supposed divine lineage, establishing themselves as the central authority, even if their control in the early days was more symbolic than absolute. Think of it like a very influential family hosting the biggest, most exclusive parties, and everyone else just had to show up. You start to see the emergence of a more centralized government, with a distinct emphasis on courtly rituals and a growing embrace of continental influences, particularly from China and Korea. This wasn't just about borrowing cool new ideas. It was about adopting sophisticated administrative systems, writing, and crucially, Buddhism. Buddhism arrived in Japan around the 6th century, and it wasn't just another philosophy. It was a game changer. Imagine a complex, deeply spiritual system arriving in a land where animistic beliefs and ancestor worship were the norm. It sparked immediate fascination and, predictably, some resistance. Historians still argue whether its adoption was primarily a spiritual awakening or a political maneuver by the Yamato court to further solidify its power by aligning itself with the advanced cultures of the mainland. Probably a bit of both, because when isn't power at least a little bit involved? Suddenly, you have grand temples being erected, intricate rituals being performed, and a whole new layer of cultural sophistication being added to the existing tapestry. The Yamato court, by the 8th century, had decided it was time to get serious about centralizing power. This led to the establishment of Nara as the first permanent capital. Picture it, a city designed on the Chinese model, with grand avenues, impressive palaces, and magnificent temples. You'd stroll through its streets, perhaps catching a glimpse of a nobleman in silk robes, or a monk deep in prayer. This was a significant step away from the more fluid, clan-based societies of the past. The court sought to implement land reforms and a more formalized taxation system, attempting to create a unified state under imperial rule. It was an ambitious project, aiming to emulate the grandeur and efficiency of the Tang dynasty in China. Of course, as anyone who's ever tried to get a large group of people to agree on anything knows, ambition doesn't always translate into smooth sailing. Despite these efforts, the emperor's power, while divinely sanctioned, wasn't always absolute in practice. Powerful aristocratic families, often those who had helped the Yamato clan rise to prominence, continued to wield immense influence. These families, like the Fujiwara clan, began to subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, maneuver themselves into positions of power, often through strategic marriages with the imperial family. It was a bit like a perpetual game of high-stakes chess, where the pieces were sons, daughters, and prestigious appointments. You can almost hear the whispered conversations, the hushed alliances being formed in dimly lit chambers. This internal struggle for influence, this delicate dance between imperial authority and aristocratic ambition, would become a recurring theme in Japanese history, and ultimately would lay some of the groundwork for the rise of a new class of individuals who would change everything. These were the early days, a slow burn of political evolution. But the fuse was definitely lit. As the curtain rises on the Heian period, 794 1185 CE, you find yourself transported to a world of exquisite refinement and subtle power plays. The imperial court, having grown weary of Nara's Buddhist clergy's growing influence, decided a fresh start was in order. So they packed up their silks and poetry scrolls and moved the capital to Heian-kyo, what we know today as Kyoto. Imagine a city built on a grid, mirroring the cosmic order, with grand palaces and meticulously manicured gardens. This wasn't just a relocation. It was a deliberate attempt to create a new cultural and political center, one less susceptible to religious interference and more focused on aesthetic pursuits. Life in Heian-kyo, for the aristocracy, was, to put it mildly, rather charmed. You're talking about a world where beauty was paramount, where a perfectly composed poem could open doors and hearts, and where the scent of incense wafted through lavishly decorated homes. Courtiers, both men and women, spent their days cultivating an almost obsessive appreciation for art, literature, and fashion. Think of it. You'd be judged not just on your lineage, but on the elegance of your handwriting, the shade of your kimono, or your ability to improvise a witty verse during a moon viewing party. It sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Almost like a permanent vacation. If your vacation involved a lot of formal wear and intense social scrutiny, at the heart of this gilded cage was the Fujiwara clan, who, remember them from Section 1? They truly perfected the art of indirect rule. While the emperor remained the divine figurehead, the Fujiwara essentially ran the show. They achieved this not through military might, but through strategic marriages. They'd marry their daughters to emperors, ensuring their grandsons would ascend the throne, and then act as regents or prime ministers for these young, impressionable rulers. It was a brilliant, almost imperceptible takeover. You wouldn't see them storming the palace. You'd see them hosting elegant banquets where subtle political machinations unfolded over cups of sake. Historians still argue whether the Fujiwara's prolonged dominance was a necessary period of stability for cultural flourishing or a parasitic appropriation of imperial power that ultimately weakened the state. It's a bit like wondering if that really comfy oversized sweater is keeping you warm or just making you sluggish. This focus on courtly life, however, meant that the aristocracy became increasingly detached from the realities of governing the provinces. While they were busy perfecting their haiku and debating the merits of different incense blends, the land beyond Heiankyo was a very different place. Local administration was often neglected and powerful. Often corrupt, provincial governors were left largely unchecked. This created a vacuum, a space where disorder could fester, and where those with the means to protect themselves and their land would inevitably rise to prominence. You can almost feel the slow, creeping anxiety outside the city walls, a stark contrast to the serene elegance within. Land ownership also underwent significant changes during this period. The system of public land, theoretically owned by the state, began to erode. Powerful families, both aristocratic and religious institutions, accumulated vast estates known as shuen. These estates were often exempt from taxation and imperial authority, effectively becoming private fiefdoms. Imagine the government trying to collect taxes, only to be told, "Oh, sorry, this land isn't really yours anymore. It belongs to Lord so-and-so." And he says, "No thank you" to your tax collectors. This decentralization of wealth and power further weakened the central government's control and financial base. As the court grew more decadent and increasingly focused on internal squabbles and aesthetic pursuits, the imperial army, once a formidable force, began to decline. Why bother with the messy business of training soldiers when you have beautiful calligraphy to admire? This neglect meant that local disputes and banditry in the provinces often went unchecked. When problems arose, the court found itself increasingly reliant on regional strongmen, individuals who possessed the practical skills of warfare that the effete courtiers had long abandoned. You can almost hear the court officials sighing, "Oh, for heaven's sake, another bandit problem? Send for that gruff fellow from the east. He seems to know how to handle these things." These regional strongmen, often descendants of minor aristocratic families who had moved to the provinces or successful local magnates, began to form their own private armies. They weren't fighting for grand ideals yet, They were protecting their lands, their families, and their wealth. They were pragmatic, tough, and knew how to wield a sword. They valued loyalty and martial prowess above all else, a stark contrast to the court's emphasis on artistic refinement. This was the nascent stage of the bushi, the warrior class, who would eventually become known as the samurai. They were the ones getting their hands dirty, while the courtiers debated the proper length of a poetic stanza. It's tempting to view the Heian period as a golden age of culture, and in many ways, for the elite, it was. Murasaki Shikibu penned The Tale of Genji, arguably the world's first novel, offering an unparalleled glimpse into the intricacies of court life. Calligraphy flourished, poetry became an art form, and unique Japanese aesthetic sensibilities like mono no aware, the pathos of things, a gentle melancholy, and the impermanence of beauty, blossomed. But underneath this shimmering veneer of elegance, the seeds of profound change were being sown. The imperial court, while culturally rich, was politically brittle, a beautiful but fragile vase. And out in the provinces, a new kind of power was quietly, steadily gathering strength. The soft whispers of courtly intrigue were about to be drowned out by the clang of steel. You can almost feel the ground shifting beneath the Heian court's perfectly polished wooden floors. While the aristocrats were composing their elegant poems, out in the provinces, a different kind of life was being forged, one of grit, self-reliance, and, increasingly, steel. This is where the rise of the warrior truly begins, not with a bang, but with a slow, undeniable consolidation of power in the hands of the bushi, those pragmatic individuals who would soon be known as the samurai. Imagine yourself living in a remote provincial area, far from the capital's luxuries. The imperial governor, if he even bothers to show up, is often more interested in lining his own pockets than in maintaining order. Bandits roam, local disputes escalate into full-blown conflicts, and the court's grand decrees feel like distant whispers. What do? You don't call the emperor, you call the toughest person around, the one with the land, the followers, and crucially, the weapons. These were often minor aristocrats who had left the refined but stifling atmosphere of Heiankyo, or powerful local landowners who had carved out their own domains. They built fortresses, trained their own retainers, and enforced their own version of law and order. It was a classic case of necessity being the mother of invention, or in this case, the mother of a whole new social class. These early warriors weren't the romanticized samurai of later periods, with their strict codes and intricate armor. They were more akin to private security forces, land managers, and enforcers all rolled into one. Their loyalty was primarily to their lord, who might be a relative, a powerful patron, or simply the individual strong enough to command respect and offer protection. They were practical fighters, adept with bows, spears, and early versions of the sword. Life was hard, and survival often depended on your ability to defend what was yours. It's like setting up a neighborhood watch, but instead of flashlights and whistles, everyone's got a really sharp sword and a penchant for direct action. One of the most significant factors in their rise was the growth of the Shun system that we touched on earlier. As vast tracts of land became private estates, exempt from central government control. These warrior families were often employed to manage and protect them. This gave them a stable economic base and a legitimate reason to maintain a private military force. It was a symbiotic relationship. The estate owner needed protection and management, and the warrior class needed land and resources to grow. This allowed them to consolidate their power, passing down their positions and lands through generations, creating powerful regional warrior clans. You start to see the emergence of a distinct warrior culture, different from the effeminate, by their standards, court. While the courtiers valued poetry and perfume, these provincial warriors valued martial prowess, loyalty, and a practical understanding of land management. Their lives revolved around training, hunting, and when necessary, fighting. This wasn't just about individual skill. It was about the strength of the group, the bond between a lord and his retainers. This early sense of collective identity would eventually evolve into the more formalized code of Bushido. But for now, it was a practical matter of survival and dominance. As the Heian court continued its elegant decline, its reliance on these provincial warrior bands grew. When disputes between powerful aristocratic families in the capital escalated, they often found themselves without a reliable military force of their own. Who did they turn to? The warriors, of course. They'd invite these rough and tumble provincials to the capital to settle their scores, offering them prestige and rewards. It's like hiring a bouncer for a tea party. Effective, but a sign that the party's lost its delicate touch. This brought the warriors into the very heart of courtly intrigue, giving them a taste of central power and showing them just how weak the emperor's actual military really was. Among these rising warrior clans, two names would come to dominate the landscape: the Taira, Heike, and the Minamoto, Genji. Both were descended from imperial princes who had been demoted to commoner status centuries earlier and had made their fortunes in the provinces. They were, in essence, aristocratic refugees who had learned to wield a sword better than a brush. The Taira initially gained significant influence within the court. They were adept at navigating the political labyrinth, marrying into noble families and holding key government positions. For a time, it looked like they might be able to integrate the warrior class into the existing power structure, much like the Fujiwara had done with Regency. However, their very success bred resentment. Other warrior clans, particularly the Minamoto, felt increasingly marginalized. The Taira's arrogance and their perceived betrayal of their warrior roots by becoming court warriors further fueled this tension. Historians still debate whether the Taira's embrace of courtly life was a strategic genius, attempting to bridge the gap between two worlds, or a fatal flaw that alienated their power base and led to their downfall. It's like wearing your best formal wear to a mud wrestling match. You might look good, but you're probably going to get dirty, and nobody's going to take you seriously as a wrestler. The simmering rivalry between these two great warrior clans, fueled by generations of competition for land, influence, and court favor, was reaching a boiling point. The court, ironically, became the stage for their escalating conflict. Small skirmishes turned into larger engagements, testing the loyalties of various provincial warrior bands. You could feel the tension in the air, a crackling electricity that hinted at the coming storm. The peaceful, poetic Heian dream was about to be shattered by the thunderous hooves of charging warriors and the clash of steel. The stage was set for a conflict that would forever alter the course of Japanese history, marking the definitive shift from rule by refined courtiers to governance by the sword. The era of the samurai was truly about to begin. And then the dam broke. All that simmering resentment, the strategic marriages, the subtle power plays, they culminated in a Kempe War, 1180-1185 CE. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was an epic, nationwide conflict, a true clash of titans that would decide the future of Japan. You're talking about a conflict so vast, it's like watching two tectonic plates grind against each other, slowly but inevitably leading to a seismic shift. Remember the two dominant warrior clans, the Taira, Heike, and the Minamoto, Genji? The Taira, having risen to significant power within the Heian court, had grown increasingly arrogant and alienated many other powerful clans, including the very imperial family members they were supposed to be serving. It's a classic tale. Get a little power, let it go to your head, and suddenly everyone who isn't you is plotting your downfall. The Minamoto, on the other hand, had been largely pushed out of central politics and were biding their time in the provinces, honing their martial skills and forging alliances with other disaffected warriors. The spark that ignited this powder keg came in 1180. A frustrated imperial prince, Prince Mochihito, feeling sidelined by Taira dominance, issued a call to arms against the Taira. This was the signal the Minamoto had been waiting for. Minamoto no Yoritomo, a shrewd and ruthless leader, took up the call from his exile in the east, rallying his clan and their allies. He was a master strategist, not just on the battlefield, but also in the realm of political maneuvering. He understood that simply winning battles wasn't enough. You had to consolidate power and create a new system. The war itself was a sprawling, brutal affair, fought across the length and breadth of Japan. You can almost feel the chill in the air as armies march through snowy mountain passes, or the humid sweat during battles fought by the sea. Key battles, like the Battle of Fuji River, where the Taira were routed by a much smaller Minamoto force, partly due to a flock of birds taking flight and causing panic. Yes, really, it's one of those moments where nature decides the outcome. Or the fierce naval engagements showcase the brutal realities of this period. This wasn't about polite duels. It was about total warfare, where survival meant destroying your enemy. One of the most famous figures to emerge from the Minamoto side was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's younger half-brother. Yoshitsune was a military genius, a brilliant tactician whose daring maneuvers and charismatic leadership inspired his troops and terrified his enemies. He captured public imagination with his almost mythical exploits, like leaping over boats during naval battles. Imagine seeing someone like that on the battlefield. It's the stuff of legends. However, his very brilliance would later become a source of profound jealousy and paranoia for his elder brother, Yoritomo, highlighting the cutthroat nature of sibling rivalry in positions of power. Historians still argue whether Yoshitsune was a naive military prodigy or a politically inept warrior whose undeniable talent sealed his tragic fate at his brother's hand. The Taira, despite their initial strength and control of the court, began to suffer from overconfidence and internal divisions. They were accustomed to the luxuries of Heian-kyo, and perhaps underestimated the raw, unyielding ferocity of the provincial warriors they faced. Their naval strength was formidable, but the Minamoto's adaptability and sheer determination proved overwhelming. You could almost sense the tides turning, not just in the battles, but in the very spirit of the land. The climax of the Genpei War came at the Battle of Dan-no-ura in 1185. This was a decisive naval engagement in the Shimonoseki Straits. Imagine hundreds of ships clashing, arrows raining down, swords gleaming in the sunlight, the cries of warriors echoing across the water. It was chaos, beauty, and horror, all rolled into one. The Taira, with the young Emperor Antoku and the imperial regalia on board, made their final stand. In a desperate act, many Taira warriors, along with the emperor's grandmother, committed suicide by drowning, taking the sacred regalia with them rather than surrendering. The regalia were mostly recovered, but the emperor was lost to the waves, a truly tragic end to a dynasty and a symbol of the profound shift in power. The Minamoto victory was absolute. The Taira clan was annihilated, and with them, the last vestiges of true imperial court power faded. This wasn't just a change of ruling family, it was a fundamental reordering of Japanese society. The elegant poetic world of Heian-kyo was irrevocably broken. The warrior had triumphed over the courtier, the sword had overshadowed the brush, and pragmatic military power had replaced aristocratic refinement as the dominant force in the land. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the undisputed military master of Japan, faced a monumental task: how to govern a nation that had been ripped apart by years of civil war. He understood that simply taking over the existing court structure wouldn't work. The Heian system was fundamentally weak and inefficient. He needed something new, something that reflected the realities of warrior power. This victory marked the end of an era dominated by the imperial court and the dawn of a new age. An age where the warrior class, the samurai, would hold the reins of power for centuries to come. The stage was now set for the creation of Japan's first military government, a system that would shape the nation's destiny for the next 700 years. With the dust settled after the cataclysmic Genpei War, you stand on the precipice of a brand new era for Japan. The Minamoto clan, under the iron will of Minamoto no Yoritomo, had emerged victorious. But victory came with a hefty price tag. The entire nation needed to be rebuilt, and more importantly, governed. Yoritomo, unlike many ambitious warlords before him, wasn't content with merely replacing the Taira at court. He understood that the old imperial system, with its pampered aristocrats and focus on poetry over practical governance, was fundamentally flawed. He envisioned a new order, one where military power was the undeniable bedrock. In 1192, Yoritomo made his decisive move. He established his government in Kamakura, a strategically chosen coastal town far to the east, away from the old imperial capital of Kyoto. This geographic separation was highly symbolic. It was a clear statement that the new power center would not be swayed by the intrigues and traditions of the imperial court. Think of it like a new tech startup, setting up shop in a garage across town, rather than trying to fit into the stuffy old corporate headquarters. And with this move, Yoritomo formalized his authority by being appointed Sei Daishogun, or barbarian subduing great general, by the emperor. This title, usually temporary, became a permanent hereditary position, marking the birth of the Kamakura shogunate. The establishment of the shogunate was a monumental shift. For the first time in Japan's history, real political and military power resided not with the emperor and his court, but with a military leader. While the emperor remained a revered figure, almost a divine symbol, his role became largely ceremonial. It's a bit like having a figurehead CEO who cuts ribbons and smiles for photos, while the actual decisions are made by the hard-nosed CEO behind the scenes. This dual structure of government, with the emperor in Kyoto and the shogun in Kamakura, would define Japanese politics for centuries to come. Yoritomo was a shrewd and ruthless administrator. He understood that consolidating power meant controlling the land and the warriors who lived on it. To this end, he appointed loyal retainers as hito, stewards, and shugo, constables, across the provinces. The hito were responsible for managing estates, collecting taxes, and maintaining local order. The shugo, on the other hand, were military governors, overseeing the hito and maintaining overall peace in their respective provinces. These appointments ensured that Kamakura's authority reached into every corner of the realm, creating a hierarchical system of control that directly bypassed the imperial court. It was incredibly effective, establishing a chain of command that ran directly from the shogun down to the local level. This new system also fostered a powerful sense of loyalty directly to the shogun. Unlike the old system, where warriors often served local lords with tenuous ties to the capital, Yoritomo demanded direct allegiance. Warriors who served the shogun were known as gokenin, housemen, and they were rewarded with land, titles, and prestige for their service. This created a strong bond, a clear understanding. Loyalty to Kamakura brought rewards. Disloyalty brought swift and decisive punishment. You can imagine the tough choices these warriors faced, often having to prioritize their new loyalty to the shogun over older, more regional ties. The Kamakura period wasn't just about military might, though that was certainly its foundation. It also saw significant cultural developments, particularly the further embrace of Zen Buddhism. While other forms of Buddhism were prevalent, Zen, with its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and direct enlightenment through personal effort, resonated deeply with the warrior class. It offered a path to spiritual awakening that mirrored their martial training, self-control, focus, and a direct, unadorned approach to life and death. Historians still argue whether Zen's popularity was a genuine spiritual awakening for the samurai or a convenient philosophy that justified their disciplined, often brutal, way of life. Probably a bit of both, given how humans tend to rationalize their existence. Imagine a grizzled warrior, fresh from battle, finding solace and clarity in quiet meditation, preparing his mind for the next inevitable conflict. It's quite a powerful image. However, even the most formidable leaders face challenges, and Yoritomo was no exception. His paranoia, particularly concerning his brilliant younger brother, Yoshitsune, remember him from the Genpei War, became a destructive force. Yoritomo saw Yoshitsune's popularity and military genius as a direct threat to his authority. Despite Yoshitsune's loyal service, Yoritomo relentlessly pursued him, eventually leading to Yoshitsune's tragic demise. It's a stark reminder that even within victory, personal demons and ruthless ambition can tear families apart. This brutal pragmatism, where even family could be sacrificed for political stability, defined much of Yoritomo's rule. When Yoritomo himself died in 1199, his sudden demise plunged the shogunate into a period of uncertainty. His successors lacked his singular vision and iron grip. Power within Kamakura soon shifted. The Hojo clan, the family of Yoritomo's wife, Masako, gradually gained control. They became the hereditary regents for the shoguns, effectively holding the real power, while the Minamoto shoguns became increasingly figureheads, much like the emperor himself. It's like a corporate takeover, but instead of buying shares, they just kept marrying into the family and slowly taking over the board. This meant that while the Kamakura shogunate continued to rule, the actual decision-makers were now the Hojo regents. Despite this internal power shift, the Kamakura shogunate established a strong and stable military government that brought a period of relative peace and order after the chaos of the Genpei War. It laid the groundwork for centuries of warrior rule, fundamentally altering the social and political landscape of Japan. The age of the samurai was not just dawning, it was firmly established, and their ethos, their very way of life, would now begin to truly take shape. Now that the Kamakura shogunate is firmly in place, and the warrior class has cemented its position at the apex of Japanese society, it's time to delve into something profound and enduring. The emerging principles that guided these warriors, what would eventually be codified as Bushido. You're not just looking at a collection of fighting techniques. You're exploring a philosophy, a way of life, and a moral compass that, for centuries, defined the samurai. In these early Kamakura years, Bushido wasn't a neatly written rulebook. It was more like a collection of unspoken traditions, practical ethics, and expectations that evolved organically from the harsh realities of a warrior's life. Think of it as a set of informal guidelines passed down through action and example rather than through lectures. The focus was on loyalty, courage, honor, and self-discipline, qualities absolutely essential for survival and success in a world where your lord's favor and your own reputation were everything. Loyalty, Chuki, was arguably the cornerstone. A samurai's primary allegiance was to his lord, often to the point of sacrificing his own life. This wasn't just a nice idea. It was the glue that held the feudal system together. Imagine a vassal-lord relationship where your entire existence, your family's safety, and your economic well-being depended on your fidelity. Betrayal wasn't just a moral failing. It was an existential threat, often punishable by death for you and your entire lineage. This intense loyalty often meant putting your lord's interests above your own family or even your personal desires. It's a level of dedication that, in our modern individualistic world, might seem utterly alien. Historians still argue whether this absolute loyalty was a genuine reflection of deeply held values or a pragmatic necessity for survival in a brutal political landscape. Courage, You was another non-negotiable trait. On the battlefield, fear was a luxury no warrior could afford. But it wasn't just about facing an enemy without flinching. It was about having the moral courage to do what was right, even when difficult. This extended to personal integrity and standing by your convictions. You can almost picture a warrior facing overwhelming odds, drawing his blade not out of recklessness, but out of an unshakable determination to fulfill his duty. This wasn't some romanticized charge. It was a cold, hard decision to push through fear. Honor, Meiyo, permeated every aspect of a samurai's life. Your honor was your most precious possession, more valuable than life itself. A stain on your honor was worse than death, and often death was the only way to cleanse it. This is where the practice of seppuku, ritual suicide, eventually gained its significance. It was a way for a samurai to atone for a failure, to escape capture, or to follow his lord into death, preserving his honor and demonstrating unwavering loyalty. While it might seem gruesome to us, in their context, it was the ultimate act of defiance and control in the face of inevitable defeat or shame. It's a bit like having a nuclear option for maintaining your reputation. Self-discipline, jisei, was critical. A warrior had to master not only his physical body, but also his emotions. Displaying fear, pain, or excessive emotion was seen as a weakness. The rigorous training, the Spartan lifestyle, and the emphasis on stoicism all contributed to developing this iron will. This is where the growing influence of Zen Buddhism really starts to intersect with the warrior's ethos. Zen's emphasis on meditation, mindfulness, and detachment from worldly desires offered a spiritual framework for cultivating the mental fortitude required of a samurai. Imagine a warrior practicing zazen, clearing his mind not just for spiritual enlightenment, but also to sharpen his focus for battle, to overcome the fear of death. The two pursuits became intertwined. The Kamakura period also saw the development of the katana, the iconic samurai sword. While earlier warriors used straighter, simpler swords, the katana evolved into its distinctive curved single-edged form during this era. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a technological marvel, a weapon designed for drawing and cutting in one fluid motion. The forging process, involving folding and hammering layers of steel, created a blade of unparalleled sharpness and durability. Owning a fine katana wasn't just about having a weapon. It was a statement of status, a work of art, and a part of the samurai's very soul. You can almost hear the soft shing as it's drawn, a sound that strikes fear into opponents. Education for the samurai in this period was practical. While literacy was valued, especially for administrative tasks, the primary focus was on martial arts, archery, horsemanship, swordsmanship, and strategy. They were trained to be leaders, managers of land, and formidable fighters. This often meant a rigorous upbringing, preparing them from a young age for the responsibilities and dangers of their future roles. It's not quite send your kids to college, but more like send your kids to boot camp and then give them a fiefdom to manage. However, this nascent Bushido wasn't universally applied, nor was it without its contradictions. Many warriors acted purely out of self-interest, shifting loyalties when it suited them, or engaging in brutal acts that seemed to defy any ethical code. Historians still grapple with the extent to which Bushido was a lived reality for all samurai, or an idealized concept that emerged later as a romanticized version of their past. It's like the difference between how people actually behave and how they wish they behaved. Nevertheless, the ideal of Bushido served as a powerful aspirational goal, shaping the identity and expectations of the warrior class for generations. This early development of a warrior code, combined with the stable administrative structure of the Kamakura shogunate, created a powerful new force in Japan. The samurai were not just soldiers. They were becoming the ruling elite, imbued with a distinct cultural identity and a set of values that, even in their formative stages, set them apart. They were prepared for anything, or so they thought, because something was stirring far beyond Japan's shores. An external threat unlike anything they had ever faced. One that would test their newfound resilience to its very limits. Just as the Kamakura shogunate was settling into its rhythm and the early principles of Bushido were taking root, a colossal storm began to gather on the horizon. One that would test the very fabric of Japan's warrior-led society. You're about to witness one of the most incredible periods in Japanese history. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century. This wasn't just another clan dispute. This was an existential threat from an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. Imagine, if you will, the early 1270s. Word begins to trickle into Japan from continental Asia. A fearsome new power, the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had swept across China, Korea, and vast swathes of Eurasia, creating the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their armies were legendary for their ferocity, discipline, and sheer overwhelming numbers. They had conquered everything in their path, and now they had their sights set on Japan. You can almost feel the collective gulp in Kamakura, a sudden realization that their isolated island existence might not protect them forever. Kublai Khan, having established the Yuan dynasty in China, began sending envoys to Japan, demanding submission. His letters were polite but firm, essentially saying, "Submit or face the consequences." The Hojo regents, who effectively governed in the shogun's name, faced a monumental decision. Should they acknowledge the Khan's supremacy and pay tribute, or defy the most powerful empire on earth? Their answer was unequivocal, and perhaps foolishly brave. They refused. They even executed some of the envoys, a clear act of defiance that guaranteed retribution. It's like telling a hungry tiger, "No, I will not give you my lunch," and then poking it with a stick. The first invasion came in 1274. A massive fleet, estimated to be around 900 ships, carrying perhaps 30,000, 40,000 Mongol, Korean, and Chinese soldiers, set sail for Japan. You can picture the sheer scale of it, a dark armada appearing on the horizon. The Japanese samurai, accustomed to ritualized single combat and fighting on land, were about to face an entirely different kind of warfare. The Mongols employed combined arms tactics, using coordinated attacks with archers, cavalry, and even rudimentary gunpowder weapons. Bombs, essentially, which must have been terrifyingly new. They fought as a cohesive unit, unlike the more individualistic approach of the samurai. The initial engagements on Kyushu were brutal. Japanese warriors, expecting to announce themselves and engage in one-on-one duels, were met with volleys of arrows and concentrated attacks that overwhelmed their traditional fighting style. It was a harsh lesson in modern warfare. However, the Japanese, despite being outmatched in terms of tactics and numbers, fought with incredible ferocity and desperate courage, slowing the Mongol advance. They were defending their homeland, their families, and their honor. Then something remarkable happened. A powerful typhoon, an act of nature, swept through the straits, scattering and destroying a significant portion of the Mongol fleet. The invasion was utterly devastated, forcing the survivors to retreat. The Japanese saw this as divine intervention, a sign that their gods, especially the wind god Fujin, had protected them. They called this miraculous storm the kamikaze, or divine wind. It was a moment of profound relief and reinforced their belief in Japan's sacred destiny. Despite this divine wind, the Japanese knew the Mongols would return. The Hojo regents didn't rest on their laurels. They immediately began preparations for the next invasion. You can imagine the frantic activity. Thousands of laborers were mobilized to build a defensive stone wall, known as the Ginkgo Burui, along the coast of Hakata Bay in Kyushu, where they expected the next landing. Samurai were ordered to be on constant alert, improving their tactics and preparing for a different kind of war. It was an island nation bracing for the inevitable. The second invasion force, launched in 1281, was even larger. Kublai Khan was furious at the previous defeat and assembled an immense fleet of perhaps 4,400 ships and an estimated 140,000 soldiers. This was one of the largest naval invasions in history until D-Day. Imagine standing on the shore, watching this seemingly endless armada approaching. It must have been truly terrifying. This time, however, the Japanese were better prepared. The coastal defenses held, preventing the Mongols from establishing a strong beachhead. The fighting became a grueling stalemate, with the samurai launching daring raids on the Mongol ships and camps, preventing them from consolidating their forces. For weeks, the two sides were locked in a desperate struggle until, once again, nature intervened. Another colossal typhoon, even more powerful than the first, struck the Mongol fleet. It was utterly annihilated. Ships smashed against rocks, countless soldiers drowned. The second kamikaze had saved Japan again. The impact of these invasions was profound. Japan had miraculously fended off two of the largest invasion attempts in history, a feat that bolstered national pride and reinforced the belief in Japan's divine protection. However, there were significant internal consequences. The war had been incredibly costly, both in terms of resources and manpower. The samurai, who had fought valiantly, expected rewards, land and titles for their service, as was customary after a major victory. But because there was no new land to conquer or distribute, they had simply defended existing land. The Kamakura shogunate was unable to adequately reward many of its loyal retainers. This lack of reward, combined with the strain of constant military preparedness, led to growing dissatisfaction among the samurai. Many had gone into debt to fund their participation in the war, and the shogunate's inability to compensate them created deep-seated resentment. historians still argue whether the financial strain of the Mongol invasions was the primary cause of the Kamakura shogunate's eventual decline, or if it merely accelerated existing internal weaknesses. Regardless, the seeds of discontent were firmly sown. The divine wind had saved Japan from foreign conquest, but it had also, ironically, begun to erode the very foundations of the Kamakura shogunate from within. The stage was being set for the next chapter of political upheaval. The divine winds of the kamikaze had saved Japan from the Mongols, but as you now observe, they couldn't save the Kamakura shogunate from itself. The immense financial and social strain caused by the two invasion attempts, coupled with the shogunate's inability to reward its samurai, led to a slow but inexorable decline. You can almost hear the subtle creak and groan of a mighty structure beginning to show its age. Its foundations weakened by invisible stresses. The samurai, who had fought with such valor and commitment, found themselves in a difficult position. Many had incurred significant debts preparing for and participating in the defense. They had mortgaged their lands, sold off possessions, and sacrificed their livelihoods, expecting to be compensated with new lands or positions, as was the tradition after successful campaigns. However, since the Mongol invasions were defensive, there was no new territory to distribute, no spoils of war to parcel out. The Hojo regents, despite their efforts, simply couldn't satisfy the demands of their vast network of retainers. This led to widespread resentment and a fracturing of the loyalties that had once bound the Gokinin directly to Kamakura. Adding to the shogunate's woes was a series of natural disasters and economic downturns that further exacerbated the financial plight of the samurai and the populace. Famines, epidemics, and even more typhoons hit the archipelago, contributing to a general sense of instability and hardship. When people are struggling to feed their families, their patience with a distant, seemingly unresponsive government tends to wear thin. Meanwhile, in Kyoto, the imperial court, though largely ceremonial, had never fully accepted its diminished role. Remember how the emperor was reduced to a figurehead by Minamoto no Yoritomo? Well, after generations of this, some ambitious emperors began to quietly scheme, looking for an opportunity to restore imperial power. Emperor Go-Daigo was one such figure. He was a determined and politically astute ruler who recognized the growing discontent with the Kamakura shogunate. He saw an opening, a chance to reclaim the ancient authority of the imperial line. It's like a quiet, dignified old noble who's been sidelined for decades, suddenly realizing the corporate bosses are floundering, and he just might have a chance to take back control. Go-Daigo began to secretly conspire with disaffected samurai and Buddhist monasteries, forming a loose alliance against Kamakura. His plan was ambitious, and initially, it seemed doomed to fail. The shogunate was still a formidable military power. However, the depth of disaffection among the samurai was greater than the Hojo regents realized. When Kamakura sent its own generals to suppress Go-Daigo's rebellion, many of these generals, seeing the weakness of the shogunate and the potential for a new order, switched sides. The most famous of these turncoats was Ashikaga Takauji. He was a powerful general, a descendant of the Minamoto clan, and initially sent by Kamakura to crush Go-Daigo's revolt. But Takauji, observing the popular support for the emperor and sensing the inevitable decline of the Hojo, made a monumental decision. He betrayed Kamakura, sided with Go-Daigo, and marched his forces on the shogunate's capital. In 1333, Kamakura fell, marking the end of the first warrior government. The Hojo regents, along with many loyal samurai, committed suicide in a mass act of seppuku rather than face capture. Go-Daigo, elated, believed he had truly restored imperial rule. This brief period is known as the Kenmu Restoration, 1333-1336. However, the emperor quickly learned that turning against a military government doesn't mean the military goes away. He alienated the very samurai who had helped him, primarily by trying to re-establish a court-centric government and denying them the rewards they felt they deserved. He appointed courtiers to key positions, bypassing the warriors who had fought for him. This was a classic case of not knowing your audience. You can practically hear the samurai grumbling. We just overthrew one military government, not to bring back the poetry club. Ashikaga Takauji, who had done the heavy lifting of overthrowing Kamakura, found himself increasingly at odds with Go-Daigo. Takauji believed that a new military government was necessary for stability, one that acknowledged the power of the samurai. Go-Daigo, however, clung to the idea of direct imperial rule. This fundamental disagreement quickly led to a new conflict. Takauji, supported by the disgruntled warrior class, turned against Go-Daigo. In 1336, Takauji effectively drove Emperor Go-Daigo out of Kyoto and installed a new emperor. Go-Daigo fled south and established a rival imperial court in Yoshino. This began the northern and southern courts period, Nanbokucho, a bizarre and chaotic era where Japan had two rival imperial lines, both claiming legitimacy for over 50 years. Historians still argue which of the two imperial lines was the true one, though the northern court was generally supported by the shogunate. It's like a really drawn-out family feud where both sides claim to be the rightful heirs to the family fortune. Ultimately, Ashikaga Takauji established his own shogunate in Kyoto in 1338, ushering in the Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi shogunate, named after the Muromachi district in Kyoto, where their headquarters were located. While it restored warrior rule, it differed significantly from its Kamakura predecessor. Unlike Kamakura, which was a clear break from Kyoto, the Ashikaga shogunate was based within the imperial capital. This meant a closer, though often strained, relationship with the court, leading to a blending of warrior and aristocratic cultures that would characterize this new period. The samurai were now truly embedded in the political and cultural heart of Japan. But the path to stable governance was far from smooth. As Japan was about to enter an era of unprecedented internal strife, as the Ashikaga shogunate took root in Kyoto, bringing the warriors into the heart of the old imperial capital, you might expect a return to stability after the fall of Kamakura and the brief, chaotic Kenmu restoration. But if you've been paying attention to Japan's history so far, you'll know that peace is often fleeting, and internal tensions rarely vanish with a mere change of leadership. Indeed, the Ashikaga shogunate, despite its grand intentions, was inherently weaker than its predecessor, and this inherent instability would eventually erupt into a conflict so devastating it would plunge Japan into a century of relentless civil war. This, my friend, is the story of the Onin War. The Ashikaga shoguns, unlike the formidable Minamoto no Yoritomo, never truly managed to establish the same level of centralized control. While they were shoguns, their authority largely depended on the support of powerful regional lords known as daimyo. These daimyo, essentially feudal magnates, held vast swaths of land and commanded significant private armies. Think of it like a king whose power is constantly being challenged by powerful dukes and counts who have their own armies and aren't afraid to use them. The shogunate's influence often extended only as far as its direct vassals, and even then, loyalty could be fickle. The Ashikaga shoguns tried to maintain control by playing these daimyo against each other, using a delicate balance of alliances, rivalries, and strategic marriages. It was a constant high-wire act where one wrong move could tip the scales towards rebellion. This system, while preventing any single daimyo from becoming too powerful, also created a perpetually unstable political environment, a powder keg waiting for a spark. You can almost feel the simmering tension, the polite smiles hiding fierce ambition in the shogun's court. The spark finally arrived in 1467, and it came from an unexpected place, a succession dispute within the Ashikaga shogun's own family. The 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, a man more interested in art, poetry, and building elaborate gardens than in the grubby business of governance. He's the one responsible for the beautiful Ginkakuji, the silver pavilion by the way, had no clear heir. His wife, Hino Tomiko, wanted their young son to succeed, while Yoshimasa had initially promised the succession to his younger brother, Ashikaga Yoshimi, who was a monk. This seemingly internal family squabble quickly escalated into a national crisis because two of the most powerful daimyo, each commanding vast armies, chose opposite sides in the dispute. On one side was Hosokawa Katsumoto, a shrewd and influential leader who supported Yoshimi. On the other was Yamana Sozen, known as the Red Monk, due to his ruddy complexion and fierce demeanor, who backed the shogun's infant son. These two men were already fierce rivals, and the succession dispute provided the perfect pretext for their long-simmering animosity to erupt into open warfare. Historians still argue whether the Onin War was primarily caused by a weak shogunate that allowed such a succession dispute to escalate, or if it was an inevitable clash between powerful daimyo whose ambitions had simply outgrown the existing political framework. Kyoto, the elegant capital of refinement and culture, became the primary battlefield. Imagine this: the very city where aristocrats once composed delicate poems and warriors honed their Zen meditation was now engulfed in flames. For 11 agonizing years, from 1467 to 1477, the city was utterly devastated. Streets became battlegrounds, temples were burned, and palaces were razed. The fighting was fierce and relentless, with both sides occupying different parts of the city, constantly raiding and skirmishing. You can almost smell the smoke, hear the cries of battle, and see the once beautiful city reduced to rubble. It was an utter tragedy for the residents of Kyoto, who endured starvation, displacement, and constant fear. The Onin War wasn't just confined to Kyoto, though the capital bore the brunt of the fighting. The conflict radiated outwards, drawing in regional lords and their armies from across Japan. Alliances shifted frequently, and what started as a clear-cut conflict between two factions quickly devolved into a multi-sided struggle with no clear lines. Loyalty became a scarce commodity, and the concept of Gekokujo, the low overthrowing the high, began to gain traction, a direct consequence of the shogunate's weakened authority. By the time the two main protagonists, Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen, both died in 1473, the war had lost its original focus. It simply petered out by 1477, not with a decisive victory for one side, but out of sheer exhaustion. The shogunate was left utterly discredited and powerless, its authority shattered beyond repair. The emperor's position, already largely ceremonial, became even more diminished, often struggling to even fund basic court ceremonies. The most profound consequence of the Onin War was the collapse of central authority and the fragmentation of Japan into countless warring domains. The traditional system of daimyo loyalty to the shogun dissolved, replaced by an every man for himself mentality. This marked the beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, a century and a half of relentless civil strife that would redefine Japan. The elegant, if somewhat detached world of the Ashikaga shoguns, obsessed with tea ceremony and refined arts, was now officially over. The samurai, freed from any overarching authority, would now fight not for a distant shogun, but for their own survival, their own land, and their own ambition. It was a chaotic, brutal, and utterly fascinating new chapter about to unfold. The Onin War didn't just end, it collapsed, leaving Japan not with a victor, but with a gaping power vacuum. And from that vacuum emerged the Sengoku Jidai, 1467–1568, a period aptly named the Warring States era. You are now entering a century and a half of relentless conflict, shifting alliances, and a dizzying array of regional warlords, each vying for supremacy. If the previous periods were chess matches, this was a 100-player free-for-all, with no rules, and everyone trying to be the last one standing. Imagine a map of Japan, once dotted with areas of shogunate or imperial control, now fractured into hundreds of tiny independent domains. Each of these domains was ruled by a local daimyo, a feudal lord who commanded his own samurai army, built his own castles, and made his own laws. These daimyo weren't just fighting for glory, they were fighting for survival. Expand or be swallowed. It was a brutal Darwinian existence, but only the strong, the cunning, and the adaptable could hope to endure. The concept of Gekokujo, where the low overcome the high, truly defined this era. Loyal retainers could overthrow their lords, vassals could challenge their daimyo, and even farmers, if sufficiently organized, could rise up against their oppressors. It's like watching a corporate ladder, where suddenly anyone can kick out their boss and take their place, and then their boss's boss. This constant flux meant that loyalty, while still valued in theory, was often a temporary commodity, contingent on a lord's ability to deliver victory and stability. You can practically hear the whispers of betrayal in every castle courtyard. Life for the average person during the Sengoku Jidai was incredibly harsh. Constant warfare meant disrupted agriculture, destroyed villages, and endless conscription. Roads were unsafe, trade was difficult, and fear was a daily companion. Yet, amidst this chaos, there were surprising bursts of innovation and cultural development. Daimyo, seeking to strengthen their domains, often fostered new agricultural techniques, built infrastructure, and encouraged commerce within their territories. Some even welcomed European traders and missionaries, leading to the introduction of firearms and Christianity, both of which would have a profound impact on the course of the war. The introduction of firearms, arquebuses, by the Portuguese in the mid-16th century was a game-changer. Imagine samurai, accustomed to the elegant arc of an arrow or the precise cut of a sword, suddenly facing a weapon that could kill from a distance with a deafening boom. It revolutionized warfare, making traditional samurai tactics less effective and emphasizing the need for disciplined infantry formations. While swordsmanship and archery remained important, the future of warfare was clearly trending towards gunpowder. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of firearms prolonged the Sengoku Jidai by making battles even more lethal, or if it eventually accelerated unification by favoring larger, more organized armies. The Sengoku Jidai saw the rise of many remarkable figures, each a legendary warrior and strategist in their own right. You have men like Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, known for his brilliant cavalry tactics and his eternal rivalry with Uesugi Kenshin. And then there's Uesugi Kenshin, the Dragon of Echigo, a deeply devout Buddhist warrior often portrayed as the epitome of chivalry, who nevertheless was a fearsome opponent on the battlefield. Their clashes, like the battles of Kawanakajima, are legendary, often resulting in tactical stalemates that became epic sagas. Castles also evolved dramatically during this period. No longer just simple wooden strongholds, they became massive, intricate fortifications, often built on strategic hills or rivers, designed to withstand prolonged sieges and gunpowder attacks. Think of the grand, multi-storied keeps you see in movies. Many of those designs came from this era, a testament to the constant need for defense. They weren't just military strongholds. They were also administrative centers, symbolizing the daimyo's power over his domain. Despite the chaos, a fundamental desire for order began to emerge. The constant warfare was unsustainable. People longed for peace, and increasingly, the idea of a unified Japan under a single, strong ruler gained traction. This wasn't just a nostalgic yearning for the old days. It was a pragmatic recognition that only a strong, unified government could put an end to the endless cycle of violence. This aspiration set the stage for the emergence of the three great unifiers of Japan, three extraordinary individuals who, one after another, would rise above the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai and eventually bring about a lasting peace. The first of these unifiers would be a man of ruthless ambition, an innovator who embraced new technologies, and a figure who famously declared, "If the cuckoo does not sing, I will kill it." This speaks volumes about his character and his approach to leadership in an era defined by brutal pragmatism. You've heard of the chaos. Now prepare to meet the forces that would attempt to tame it, starting with a man who truly understood the meaning of power in a fractured land. Out of the swirling vortex of the Sengoku Jidai, a figure of undeniable ambition and brutal effectiveness began to rise, carving a path through the chaos with fire and steel. This was Oda Nobunaga, 1534 to 1582, the first of the three great unifiers of Japan. You're about to meet a man who was both a military genius and a ruthless innovator. Someone who recognized that the old ways wouldn't suffice to bring order to a fractured nation. Nobunaga emerged from the minor daimyo family of Owari province, a relatively small and unassuming domain. Imagine starting your climb to global dominance from a humble garage, but instead of coding, you're perfecting how to use muskets and crush your rivals. From an early age, he was known for his unconventional behavior and sometimes erratic temperament, earning him the nickname Fool of Owari. Yet, beneath this seemingly wild exterior lay a mind of sharp intellect and strategic brilliance. He quickly consolidated control over his home province, often through swift and brutal actions against rivals and even family members who stood in his way. For Nobunaga, family loyalty was secondary to strategic advantage. One of Nobunaga's most significant early victories was the Battle of Okehazama in 1560. He faced an overwhelmingly superior force led by Imagawa Yoshimoto, a powerful daimyo marching on Kyoto. Instead of a direct confrontation, Nobunaga used a daring surprise flank attack during a sudden downpour, catching Imagawa's forces off guard and killing him. It was a testament to his innovative tactics and his willingness to take immense risks. This victory, against incredible odds, dramatically boosted his reputation and solidified his control over Owari. It's like winning a major championship when everyone thought you'd be eliminated in the first round. Nobunaga understood the power of new technologies. He was one of the first major daimyo to wholeheartedly embrace firearms, which had been introduced by the Portuguese. He didn't just equip a few of his samurai with arquebuses. He trained large units of common foot soldiers to use them in disciplined volleys, essentially creating Japan's first truly modern infantry. This was revolutionary. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his arquebusiers, protected by wooden stockades, decimated the famed cavalry charges of Takeda Katsuyori, son of Shingen, whom you remember. This battle is often cited as a turning point, demonstrating the overwhelming power of organized gunpowder units against traditional samurai tactics. It's a bit like introducing machine guns to a medieval battlefield. The outcome is almost predetermined. Nobunaga's ambition stretched beyond military conquest. He aimed to unify the realm under a single sword, Tenkafubu. To achieve this, he relentlessly pursued a policy of expansion, conquering rival daimyo and extending his control across central Japan. He was a master of logistics, building roads and ensuring steady supplies for his armies. He also recognized the importance of commerce and actively promoted trade, abolishing customs barriers and encouraging merchant guilds, seeing economic prosperity as crucial to funding his wars. He was remarkably pragmatic, often disregarding traditional social hierarchies if it suited his objectives. His relationship with Buddhism was complex, to say the least. Powerful Buddhist monasteries, particularly the warrior monks of the Enryakuji on Mount Hiei, had become significant political and military powers during the Sengoku Jidai, often siding with his enemies. Nobunaga saw them as obstacles to unification. In 1571, in an act of shocking brutality, he ordered the complete destruction of Enryakuji, massacring thousands of monks and burning the entire complex to the ground. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a clear message that no power, not even spiritual, would stand in his way. Historians still argue whether Nobunaga's persecution of Buddhist monasteries was a necessary evil for unification, or an act of profound sacrilege that stained his legacy. It's safe to say he wasn't winning any Most Pious Leader awards. Nobunaga also adopted a relatively tolerant stance towards Christianity, at least initially. He saw the European missionaries as a counterweight to the powerful Buddhist establishment, and their trade goods, particularly firearms, were highly valuable. He even allowed churches to be built and conversion to take place in his territories, a stark contrast to the later isolationist policies. You can imagine the culture shock for the European Jesuits arriving in Japan, encountering a powerful warlord who seemed interested in their technology more than their theology. By the early 1580s, Nobunaga was on the cusp of achieving his grand vision. He controlled a vast swathe of Japan and seemed unstoppable. However, his relentless ambition and often cruel temperament had created many enemies, even among his most trusted retainers. In 1582, while staying at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, he was betrayed by one of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. Mitsuhide suddenly turned his army on Nobunaga, besieging the temple. Rather than surrender, Nobunaga famously chose to commit seppuku in the burning temple, ending his life with dignity. His exact last moments are still debated, shrouded in a combination of historical fact and dramatic legend. Nobunaga's death left a power vacuum threatening to plunge Japan back into chaos. However, his work had laid the crucial groundwork for unification. He had broken the power of the old institutions, established new military tactics, and set the stage for someone to complete his vision. That someone would be a man of humble origins, a former sandal bearer, who would now step into the spotlight and attempt to consolidate what Nobunaga had started. Nobunaga's dramatic death at Honnoji left a gaping hole in the nascent unification effort, a moment that could easily have plunged Japan back into the full-blown chaos of the Sengoku Jidai. But fate, or perhaps sheer determination, had other plans, and a new figure stepped onto the grand stage, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537 to 1598. You are now witnessing the astonishing rise of a man who started life as a sandal bearer and ended up ruling all of Japan. His story is a true rags to riches saga, a testament to ambition, cunning, and an unparalleled ability to charm and conquer those around him. Hideyoshi's origins were incredibly humble. He was born into a peasant family without a samurai lineage, which was almost unheard of for someone who would eventually unify the nation. Imagine climbing the ranks of an elite, aristocratic institution from the very bottom, based purely on merit and a sharp wit. He joined Nobunaga as a lowly servant, famously warming his lord's sandals in winter. But Hideyoshi possessed an acute intelligence, a knack for logistics, and an almost superhuman work ethic. He quickly rose through Nobunaga's ranks, distinguishing himself as a brilliant general, a master negotiator, and a shrewd administrator. Nobunaga often teased him with the nickname Monkey due to his appearance. but he clearly recognized Hideyoshi's immense talent. When Nobunaga was betrayed and killed by Akechi Mitsuhide, Hideyoshi acted with lightning speed. He was campaigning far from Kyoto, but he immediately negotiated a swift truce with his current opponents, marched his army hundreds of miles back to the capital in a legendary Great Chugoku retreat, and swiftly defeated Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, 1582, just days after Nobunaga's death. This incredibly decisive action cemented his position as Nobunaga's legitimate successor and avenger. It was a bold move that cleared the path for his own ascent. Hideyoshi then skillfully outmaneuvered Nobunaga's other generals and his young heirs, consolidating his power through a combination of military victories, clever diplomacy, and strategic marriage alliances. He didn't just conquer, he absorbed. He offered generous terms to defeated opponents, often integrating them into his new power structure rather than simply annihilating them. He was famously quoted as saying, "If the cuckoo does not sing, I will try to make it sing," a stark contrast to Nobunaga's "kill it." This willingness to negotiate and persuade, rather than always resort to brute force, was a key aspect of his genius. By the late 1580s, Hideyoshi had completed the process of unifying Japan, bringing all the remaining powerful daimyo under his control. He accomplished this through a series of brilliant campaigns, notably the Siege of Odawara, 1590, which brought the powerful Hojo clan to their knees. Having started from nothing, he now commanded the entire archipelago. With unification achieved, Hideyoshi set about consolidating his rule and implementing policies designed to ensure lasting peace and prevent future rebellions. You're talking about comprehensive reforms that touched every aspect of Japanese society. Firstly, he initiated the sword hunt, katanagari, in 1588. This nationwide decree ordered all peasants and commoners to surrender their weapons, swords, spears, and firearms. The stated purpose was to melt them down and use the iron to forge a giant statue of the Buddha, a clever way to mask the real intention, disarming the peasant class to prevent future uprisings. This fundamentally separated the samurai from the rest of society, making them the sole armed class. It's like removing all the sharp objects from the kitchen and leaving only the chefs with knives. Clear roles, fewer accidental or intentional conflicts. Secondly, he conducted a comprehensive land survey, Taiko Kenchi, across the entire country. This survey meticulously measured and assessed all agricultural land, standardizing units of measurement and determining productivity. This allowed Hideyoshi to accurately assess the taxable output of each domain and solidify the revenue base for his central government. It also effectively froze the social mobility of the peasant class, tying them to their land. Farmers could no longer leave their land without permission, and samurai were forbidden from engaging in farming. This clear division of labor and class was known as the separation of samurai and peasant, Heino Bonri, a crucial step in formalizing the feudal structure. Hideyoshi also established a rigid social hierarchy, further solidifying the samurai's position at the top. He prohibited social mobility, ensuring that status was inherited. This brought an end to the chaotic Gikokujo that characterized the Sengoku Jidai, bringing order to the social structure. Despite his immense power, Hideyoshi never took the title of shogun. As a man of peasant birth, he was ineligible for the hereditary title, which was reserved for descendants of the Minamoto clan. Instead, he had himself appointed Kampaku, imperial regent, and later Taiko, retired regent, effectively ruling from behind the emperor. This was a clever workaround, allowing him to wield supreme power without violating ancient traditions. Historians still debate whether Hideyoshi's inability to become shogun was a true limitation to his power or merely a formality given his absolute control. Hideyoshi's ambition, however, wasn't limited to Japan. With the country unified, he turned his gaze outwards towards the Korean peninsula and ultimately China. This marked a new, far more problematic phase of his rule. But for a time, he brought a fragile, hard-won peace to Japan, a peace that was built on the foundations laid by Nobunaga, but secured and formalized by Hideyoshi's unique blend of strategic brilliance and political finesse. The nation, exhausted by over a century of war, briefly breathed a sigh of collective relief under his command. Having unified Japan, a feat no one before him had fully accomplished. You might think Toyotomi Hideyoshi would settle down, consolidate his gains, and enjoy the fruits of his extraordinary rise. But, as you're about to discover, the ambition of a man who rose from sandal bearer to supreme ruler is rarely satisfied by domestic achievements alone. Instead, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outwards, towards the continent, embarking on a series of ill-fated campaigns known as the Korean invasions, 1592-1598. These ventures would ultimately drain Japan's resources, end in bitter failure, and leave a complicated legacy both at home and abroad. Imagine Hideyoshi at the peak of his power, looking across the sea. His stated goal was to conquer Korea, then China, Ming Dynasty, and eventually even India. This wasn't just a whim. He saw himself as a divinely appointed conqueror, a second coming of Genghis Khan, as some historians suggest. His motives were complex. Perhaps a need to find an outlet for the vast number of samurai now unemployed by peace, a desire for personal glory, or a strategic move to secure trade routes. Historians still argue whether Hideyoshi's true objective was simply Korea as a stepping stone, or if his grand vision of conquering China was a realistic, if audacious, military objective. Regardless, the stage was set for a massive undertaking. In 1592, Hideyoshi launched the first invasion of Korea, known as the Imjin War. A massive Japanese army, estimated at around 160,000 to 200,000 samurai, equipped with firearms and experienced from the Sengoku Jidai, landed on the Korean peninsula. You can picture the terrifying efficiency of this force as it swept through Korea, rapidly capturing cities including the capital, Hanyang, modern-day Seoul. The Koreans, unprepared for this scale of invasion and lacking modern firearms, were quickly overwhelmed. It looked, at first, like a stunning success for Hideyoshi. However, several critical factors quickly turned the tide against the Japanese. Firstly, the Korean resistance, though initially scattered, soon found a brilliant naval commander in Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Yi Sun-sin, using his innovative turtle ships, Gyeobakseon, armored ships with spiked roofs to deter boarding and dragon-shaped prows that emitted smoke, decimated the Japanese supply lines. Imagine the frustration of the Japanese army, deep within Korea, running out of food and ammunition because their supply ships kept getting sunk. It's like trying to fight a war without a reliable Amazon delivery service. The Japanese land forces, formidable as they were, couldn't sustain themselves without constant resupply by sea. Secondly, the Ming dynasty of China, recognizing the threat to its own security if Japan conquered Korea, sent a massive expeditionary force to aid the Koreans. The Ming army, though not always effective, significantly bolstered Korean defenses and provided crucial manpower, turning the tide of the land war into a grinding stalemate. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting other Japanese, now faced a combined Sino-Korean force with superior numbers and different tactics. The war devolved into a brutal attritional struggle. The Japanese forces, bogged down in Korea, suffered from disease, cold, and constant guerrilla attacks from Korean civilians and militia. Negotiations often broke down, and the conflict dragged on with no clear resolution. Hideyoshi, growing increasingly frustrated back in Japan, continued to demand more from his generals, often making unrealistic demands. The first invasion eventually wound down in 1596, largely due to a combination of Japanese supply issues, Ming counteroffensives, and a desperate desire for peace on all sides. It was not a decisive victory for Japan, but rather a strategic withdrawal dressed up as a temporary truce. But Hideyoshi, consumed by his grand vision and unwilling to accept defeat, launched a second invasion in 1597. This second attempt, though smaller in scale, faced even fiercer resistance from the revitalized Korean and Ming forces. Admiral Yi Sun-sin again proved to be the bane of the Japanese Navy, inflicting crushing defeats, most notably at the Battle of Myeongnyang, where his small fleet famously routed a much larger Japanese armada. The Korean invasions were a disaster for Japan. They drained the national treasury, exhausted the samurai class, and resulted in heavy casualties. The ambition of Hideyoshi had led to a costly and ultimately fruitless foreign adventure. For Korea, the invasions were catastrophic, leaving much of the country devastated and its population decimated. The memory of the invasions would foster deep-seated resentment against Japan for centuries. In 1598, while the second invasion was still ongoing, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, aged 61, passed away. His death was kept secret for a time to prevent the collapse of the Japanese forces in Korea. With their leader gone and facing insurmountable odds, the Japanese armies were finally ordered to withdraw, bringing an end to the 7-year conflict. Hideyoshi's death created a new, dangerous power vacuum in Japan. He had attempted to ensure the succession of his young son, Hideyori, by creating a council of 5 elders, composed of the most powerful daimyo, including Tokugawa Ieyasu, and a council of 5 commissioners. But this arrangement was inherently unstable. The stage was now set for the final decisive power struggle among Hideyoshi's former allies, a struggle that would ultimately determine the future of Japan for the next 250 years. The vast resources and manpower wasted in Korea would prove to be a significant weakness for the Toyotomi loyalists in the coming conflict. Hideyoshi's grand vision ended not with a bang, but with the whimper of withdrawal from Korea and his own passing. And with his death in 1598, the delicate balance of power he had painstakingly crafted immediately began to unravel. You're now witnessing the final climactic act in the unification of Japan, a struggle that would determine not just who ruled, but how the nation would be governed for centuries to come. All eyes turned to the most powerful of Hideyoshi's former allies, the cunning and patient Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu, 1543–1616, was a remarkable figure, often seen as the antithesis of the flamboyant Nobunaga and the ambitious Hideyoshi. He was a survivor, a master strategist who played the long game. His early life was fraught with peril, serving as a hostage to rival clans as a child, learning the harsh realities of power and patience. He had been an ally of Nobunaga, then a key general under Hideyoshi, always adapting, always consolidating his own power base in his eastern domain. His famous personal motto was, "The strong and the weak come and go. The powerful fall and rise. What remains is only the enduring." He was building something to last. Upon Hideyoshi's death, the Council of Five Elders he had established to govern until his young son, Hideyori, came of age, immediately fell into factionalism. The council was meant to ensure a smooth transition, but it became a stage for bitter rivalries. Ieyasu, as the most senior and powerful of the elders, naturally became the focal point of suspicion and ambition. He began to systematically draw allies to his side, offering promises of land and influence, and carefully isolating his rivals. The inevitable clash came down to two main factions. On one side, Ieyasu and his eastern allies, determined to seize ultimate control. On the other, the Western army, largely composed of daimyo, who remained loyal to the Toyotomi heir, Hideyori, or who simply feared Ieyasu's overwhelming ambition. The chief strategist for the Western army was Ishida Mitsunari, a brilliant administrator but less experienced military commander than Ieyasu. This wasn't just a fight for power. It was a battle for the soul of the nation, a decision on whether Japan would revert to chaos or finally achieve a lasting peace under a single dominant rule. The culmination of this struggle was the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Imagine a vast plain shrouded in a morning mist, where nearly 200,000 warriors from across Japan gathered for a single colossal confrontation. It was a true test of leadership, strategy, and critically, loyalty. Ieyasu's forces, though slightly outnumbered, were better disciplined and, crucially, had the benefit of Ieyasu's meticulous planning and his ability to sway allegiances at the 11th hour. The battle itself was a chaotic, bloody affair. For hours, the two armies clashed, neither side gaining a clear advantage. But Ieyasu had a secret weapon, hidden defections. Several key daimyo on the Western Army's side had been secretly negotiating with Ieyasu, promising to switch sides at a crucial moment. The most famous of these was Kobayakawa Hideaki, a nephew of Hideyoshi, who, after much hesitation, finally attacked the Western Army from the flank. This sudden betrayal shattered the Western Army's morale and broke their lines, turning the tide decisively in Ieyasu's favor. It's like watching a football game where a star player suddenly changes jerseys mid-play and scores for the other team. The Battle of Sekigahara was a crushing victory for Ieyasu. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed, along with many other leaders of the Western Army. The Toyotomi loyalists were routed, and Ieyasu emerged as the undisputed master of Japan. This single battle effectively ended the Sengoku Jidai, a period of unrelenting warfare that had lasted for over a century. With all rivals crushed or subdued, Ieyasu set about establishing a new shogunate, one designed to last. In 1603, he was formally appointed Sei Taishogun by the emperor, thereby establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Unlike the short-lived Kamakura or the unstable Ashikaga shogunates, Ieyasu's government was meticulously designed for endurance. He chose Edo, modern-day Tokyo, a small fishing village in his home domain in the east, as his capital. This move mirrored Yoritomo's earlier choice of Kamakura, again signifying a break from the old imperial court in Kyoto, though he maintained good relations with the emperor. Ieyasu's system, known as the Bakufu, tent government, implying a military administration, was built on a sophisticated blend of centralized control and decentralized feudalism. He maintained direct control over vast landholdings and important cities, ensuring a strong economic base. The remaining daimyo were carefully categorized and placed under strict regulations. He also implemented a system known as Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance, which forced daimyo to spend every other year in Edo, leaving their families in the capital as hostages when they returned to their domains. This was a brilliant move, designed to prevent rebellion by financially draining the daimyo. Maintaining two residences was expensive, and by providing Ieyasu with leverage over their families. Historians still argue whether Sankin Kotai was a benevolent system that fostered cultural exchange or a repressive tool that sapped the daimyo's strength. Although Hideyoshi's son, remained a potential threat, living in Osaka Castle with significant wealth and supporters, Ieyasu patiently waited for the opportune moment. That moment came in 1614-1615 with the siege of Osaka, where Ieyasu finally eliminated the Toyotomi line and solidified his family's absolute rule. Tokugawa Ieyasu created a lasting peace, a system that would govern Japan for over 250 years. He designed a society rooted in order, stability, and hierarchical control, deliberately curbing the power of the samurai class while simultaneously relying on them to enforce his rule. The brutal, chaotic age of constant warfare was over, replaced by a meticulous, almost suffocating peace. With the final defeat of the Toyotomi at Osaka Castle and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate firmly in Edo, you now enter a remarkably long and unprecedented period of Japanese history, the Edo period, 1603-1868. This wasn't just a new ruling family. It was an entirely new paradigm, a deliberate and meticulously constructed peace after centuries of devastating civil war. Imagine taking a nation that has been constantly at war for 150 years and suddenly making it peaceful. It required extraordinary measures. And that's precisely what the Tokugawa did. The hallmark of the Edo period was isolation, sakoku. The Tokugawa shoguns, having witnessed the destabilizing influence of foreign powers and the spread of Christianity, which they viewed as a potential subversive force undermining their authority, decided to completely close Japan off to the outside world. From the 1630s onwards, a series of edicts severely restricted foreign contact. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country, and those abroad were not allowed to return. Foreigners were almost entirely banned, with the exception of limited trade with the Dutch, confined to a small artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki harbor, and the Chinese. Even the Portuguese, who had introduced firearms and Christianity, were expelled. This isolation was a monumental policy decision. You can imagine the sheer logistical effort required to enforce such a ban across an entire archipelago. It was like putting a giant invisible dome over the country, allowing only a tiny trickle of outside influence to seep through. Historians still argue whether sakoku was a pragmatic necessity to ensure stability or a short-sighted policy that ultimately hindered Japan's technological and economic development, probably a bit of both, given the benefit of hindsight. The purpose of sakoku was clear: to eliminate any external threats that could destabilize the Tokugawa's newfound peace, and to prevent the spread of foreign ideas that might challenge their authority. For over 2 centuries, Japan developed largely in isolation, fostering a unique cultural identity, uninfluenced by the dramatic changes sweeping through the rest of the world. Internally, the Tokugawa created a rigid, hierarchical society designed to maintain absolute order and prevent any resurgence of Gekokujo. Society was officially divided into 4 main classes: samurai, shi, farmers, no, artisans, ko, and merchants, sho. Beneath them were various outcast groups. Social mobility was severely restricted. You were born into your class, and that was largely where you stayed. This was a deliberate effort to freeze society, removing the fluidity that had characterized the Sengoku Jidai. The daimyo were kept firmly in check by the bakufu, shogunate. Remember the sankin kotai, alternate attendance system? This was a masterstroke of control. Daimyo were required to spend every other year in Edo, maintaining lavish residences and retinues, which imposed an enormous financial burden. This prevented them from accumulating too much wealth or military power in their own domains, and crucially, kept their families in Edo as hostages. When the daimyo returned to their domains, their wives and eldest sons remained in Edo. You can practically hear the subtle sigh of relief from the shogunate every time a daimyo departed Edo, knowing their family was safely within their grasp. Despite the rigidity, the Edo period was a time of immense cultural and economic growth. With peace established, agriculture flourished, leading to a significant increase in population. Cities like Edo, which grew to become one of the largest cities in the world, eventually surpassing 1 million inhabitants. Osaka and Kyoto thrived as centers of commerce and culture. Imagine a city the size of modern-day Tokyo, but without cars or skyscrapers, bustling with people, merchants, and samurai. It would be a vibrant sensory experience. New art forms emerged and flourished, catering to the growing urban populations and merchant classes. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints depicted the floating world of kabuki actors, geisha, and landscapes, becoming incredibly popular. Kabuki theater, with its elaborate costumes and dramatic performances, and bunraku, puppet theater, provided entertainment. The strict social order might have been stifling in some ways, but the artistic output was vibrant and innovative. It's a bit like a pressure cooker, where the confined energy produces some incredibly rich and complex flavors. However, beneath this veneer of peace and prosperity, tensions simmered. The rigid class system, particularly the position of the samurai, was becoming increasingly problematic. The merchants, though at the bottom of the official hierarchy, often accumulated significant wealth, while many samurai, deprived of warfare and living on fixed stipends, found themselves struggling financially. This created a paradoxical situation where the lowest class was often wealthier than the revered warrior class. It's like finding out your local barista makes more money than a seasoned military general. The long peace also meant that the samurai, whose very identity was forged in warfare, had to adapt to a new role. Their purpose shifted from battlefield warriors to bureaucrats, administrators, and scholars. This transition wasn't always smooth, and it led to internal struggles within the samurai class, a sense of loss of purpose for some. But they continued to be the ruling elite, upholding the shogunate's laws and maintaining order. The world around them was changing, slowly but surely, and the question of how long this meticulously crafted isolation and rigid social structure could endure against the forces of change would eventually be answered, not from within, but from without. The arrival of powerful steam-powered ships on Japan's shores would soon shatter the illusion of eternal peace. The Edo period, as you've observed, was a masterclass in controlled stability, a long, quiet hum of peace after centuries of chaotic warfare. But within that carefully constructed tranquility, the very identity of the samurai began to undergo a profound transformation. You're now watching a warrior class forged in battle, forced to adapt to a world without war, struggling to define its purpose in a time of unprecedented peace. Imagine being a samurai during the Sengoku Jidai. Your life's purpose was clear: fight for your lord, protect his domain, and ideally expand it. Your skills with the sword, your bravery, your strategic mind, these were your assets, your very reason for being. Now, fast forward to the Edo period. The shogun has ensured peace. There are no more major wars, no more opportunities for grand battlefield glory. So, what does a warrior do? Their role shifted dramatically from battlefield combatants to bureaucrats, administrators, and civil servants. Many samurai became retainers in the shogun's government or in the various daimyo domains, managing finances, overseeing public works, and administering justice. They exchanged their armor for more formal attire. Their swords became largely ceremonial, though still carried as a mark of status. And their days were filled with paperwork rather than skirmishes. It's like taking a highly trained special forces operative and giving them a desk job in accounting. Some adapted brilliantly, others struggled with the mundane reality of their new existence. The Bushido Code, which had begun to formalize in the Kamakura period, was further refined and romanticized during the Edo period. No longer a practical guide for battlefield survival, it became a philosophical and ethical framework for proper conduct in times of peace. Concepts like loyalty, honor, integrity, self-discipline, and frugality were emphasized. Scholars like Yamaga Soko and Daidoji Yuzan wrote extensively on Bushido, attempting to provide a moral compass for a warrior class whose original purpose had seemingly vanished. Historians still argue whether this formalized Bushido was an authentic reflection of samurai values or a theoretical construct created to justify the samurai's privileged position in a peaceful society. It was, perhaps, a noble attempt to give meaning to a life that had lost its central function. Despite their elevated social status at the top of the four-class hierarchy, many samurai faced significant economic hardship. Their income was typically fixed stipends, paid in rice, from their lords. As the Edo period progressed, the economy became increasingly monetized, and inflation eroded the value of their fixed stipends. Meanwhile, the merchant class, officially at the bottom, grew rich through commerce. You can imagine the frustration. A samurai, proud of his lineage and status, watching a merchant, whom he technically outranked, live a life of greater luxury. This created a paradoxical situation where the warrior class, designed to be the backbone of society, became increasingly impoverished and indebted to the very merchants they looked down upon. It's almost comical, if it weren't so financially crippling. This economic disparity led to a phenomenon of ronin, masterless samurai. A samurai could become ronin if his lord was dispossessed, if he committed a serious offense and was dismissed, or sometimes by choice if he felt stifled by the rigid system. Without a lord, a ronin lost his income and status. Many struggled to make a living, often resorting to teaching martial arts, becoming bodyguards, or even, in desperate cases, banditry. This was a direct challenge to the shogunate's orderly vision, and the presence of disgruntled, skilled warriors without purpose was a constant source of anxiety for the authorities. The long peace also brought a flourishing of urban culture. Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka became vibrant centers of commerce, entertainment, and intellectual life. The chonin, or commoner class, merchants and artisans, developed their own distinct culture, enjoying kabuki theater, ukiyo-e prints, and lively urban districts. While the samurai often lived in their own districts and adhered to stricter codes of conduct, they were nonetheless influenced by the burgeoning urban scene. Imagine the contrast. A stoic samurai walking past a lively kabuki theater, perhaps secretly wishing he could shed his rigid role for a night of carefree entertainment. Education became more widespread, not just for samurai, but also for commoners. Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on loyalty, filial piety, and social harmony, became the official ideology of the shogunate, providing a moral and ethical framework for its rigid social order. Samurai were encouraged to study classics, history, and administration, broadening their intellect beyond purely martial pursuits. This was part of the shogunate's effort to redefine the samurai as intellectual and moral leaders, not just wielders of swords. However, beneath the surface of apparent stability, tensions were building. The economic struggles of the samurai, the growing wealth of the merchants, and the sheer stagnation of a society cut off from external developments were creating a quiet pressure cooker. The shogunate's elaborate system, designed to prevent conflict, was also stifling innovation and adaptation. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from way back in Section 1? Well, imagine if for 250 years that was still your best option for sun protection, while the rest of the world developed SPF 50. Japan was falling behind. The greatest challenge, however, would come not from internal rebellion, but from an external force that the Tokugawa had meticulously tried to keep at bay. As the 19th century dawned, the world outside Japan's self-imposed shell was undergoing rapid industrialization and geopolitical change. Powerful Western nations, hungry for trade and resources, were growing impatient with Japan's isolation. The stage was being set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would irrevocably shatter the peace of the Edo period and fundamentally redefine the role and future of the samurai. Within the carefully maintained peace of the Edo period, despite the shifting roles and economic struggles of the samurai, certain stories endured, becoming powerful testaments to the ideals of Bushido, even when those ideals clashed with the shogun's law. You're about to explore one of the most famous and enduring legends of the samurai, a tale of loyalty, revenge, and sacrifice. The story of the 47 Ronin. This isn't just a bedtime story. It's a foundational myth for the Japanese, an event that actually happened, though heavily romanticized and interpreted over centuries. The incident occurred between 1701 and 1703 during the height of Tokugawa peace, when the shogunate's authority was supposedly absolute. Its enduring power lies in its portrayal of unwavering samurai loyalty and honor in the face of impossible odds. The story begins with Asano Naganori, the daimyo of Ako, a relatively minor lord. He was appointed to host some imperial envoys from Kyoto to the shogun's court in Edo. For guidance on court etiquette, he was assigned a high-ranking shogunate official named Kira Yoshinaka, a master of ceremonies. Kira, however, was known for his arrogance and greed. He expected a bribe from Asano in exchange for his instruction. And when Asano, either out of principle or financial difficulty, refused to pay, Kira began to openly insult and humiliate him. Imagine being in a position of power, needing guidance from an expert, only to be constantly belittled and mocked for not paying up. The tension escalated until, one day, in the shogun's Edo castle itself, Asano Naganori, pushed beyond his limits by Kira's continuous insults, drew his sword and attacked Kira. While he only managed to inflict a minor wound, drawing a sword and attacking someone, especially a shogunate official, within the sacred confines of Edo Castle, was an unforgivable offense. It was a direct challenge to the shogun's authority and the very peace he had painstakingly established. The shogun's judgment was swift and severe. Asano Naganori was immediately ordered to commit seppuku for his transgression. His domain was confiscated, and his family was ruined. Kira, despite being the aggressor, received no punishment, a decision that many found deeply unjust. This stark imbalance of justice is a key element of the narrative. The virtuous lord punished severely, the wicked official left unscathed. You can almost feel the collective outrage of Asano's loyal retainers. Asano's retainers, now masterless samurai and thus ronin, were initially scattered. They faced a moral dilemma. According to Bushido, a samurai was expected to avenge his lord's death, especially one perceived as unjust. But avenging Asano would mean defying the shogun's direct order and inevitably lead to their own deaths. This was the ultimate clash between their personal code of honor and the law of the land. Historians still argue whether the 47 Ronin were acting purely out of unshakable loyalty, or if their actions were also a desperate gamble born of their sudden precarious status. It's a bit like choosing between a guaranteed jail sentence and an honorable death. Led by Oishi Kuranosuke, Asano's chief retainer, a core group of 47 Ronin secretly vowed to avenge their lord. They understood the risks and knew that a direct, immediate attack would be suicidal and likely fail. So, they embarked on a remarkable patient plan. For over a year they dispersed, pretending to be dissipated drunks, merchants, or even vagrants, allowing Kira to drop his guard and the shogunate's surveillance to wane. Oishi himself famously frequented brothels and public houses, feigning a life of debauchery to throw off suspicion. Imagine the sheer discipline and commitment required for such an elaborate deception, all while knowing their ultimate goal was self-sacrifice. Finally, on a snowy night in December 1702, almost 2 years after Asano's death, the 47 Ronin launched their meticulously planned attack on Kira's mansion in Edo. They scaled the walls, fought their way through Kira's guards, and eventually found Kira himself hiding in a charcoal shed. They formally identified him, then offered him the same honorable death by seppuku that their lord had been forced to take. When Kira refused, Oishi, in a final act of justice, beheaded him. Having achieved their revenge, the Ronin then marched to Sengoku Temple, Asano's burial place, where they laid Kira's head on their lord's grave. They then calmly surrendered to the shogunate authorities, fully expecting their punishment. The shogunate was in a difficult position. On one hand, the Ronin had defied their direct orders and committed murder. On the other, their act of unwavering loyalty and adherence to the samurai code resonated deeply with the populace and many within the samurai class itself. It was a clear demonstration of the ideals that the shogunate itself championed, even as it enforced a rigid legal system. After much deliberation, the shogun ruled that the Ronin, having upheld their honor, should be allowed to commit seppuku rather than suffer the dishonor of execution as common criminals. On February 4th, 1703, the 46 surviving Ronin, one had died earlier, committed ritual suicide. They were buried beside their lord at Sengoku, where their graves remain a site of pilgrimage and respect to this day. The story of the 47 Ronin became an immediate sensation and remains immensely popular in Japan. It cemented the idealized image of the samurai as fiercely loyal, honorable, and willing to sacrifice everything for their principles. It's been immortalized in countless plays, books, and films, often highlighting the tension between duty and law. This legend, arising within the Edo period, underscored the samurai's enduring spiritual power, even as their actual military utility waned. But while stories of honor captivated the domestic audience, forces far beyond Japan's shores were gathering, forces that would soon demand the very fabric of this isolated traditional world be ripped open. You've just witnessed the idealized endurance of samurai honor in the tale of the 47 Ronin, a story that resonates deeply within the quiet, ordered world of Edo, Japan. But that quietude, that deliberate isolation, was precisely what made the next chapter so jarring. You're now entering the mid-19th century, and the forces of global change are about to smash against Japan's carefully constructed walls of seclusion. This is the story of Western pressure building, a period of intense external demand that would ultimately shatter the Tokugawa shogunate and irrevocably change Japan forever. For over 200 years, the Sakoku policy had been incredibly effective. Japan was a hermit kingdom, largely untouched by the Industrial Revolution, the rise of powerful European empires, and the geopolitical shifts sweeping the globe. While the world outside was developing steamships, advanced weaponry, and global trade networks, Japan continued to operate largely on traditional systems, its technological advancement lagging significantly. It's like having a beautiful, perfectly preserved antique clock, while the rest of the world has embraced digital smartwatches. But by the 19th century, the world was shrinking, and Japan's isolation was becoming increasingly inconvenient for the burgeoning Western powers. American, British, and Russian ships, engaged in whaling, trade, and exploration, increasingly found themselves in Japanese waters. They needed coaling stations for their steamships, access to ports for resupply, and protection for shipwrecked sailors. These nations, with their superior naval technology and economic might, were no longer content to simply be turned away. The most famous and perhaps dramatic catalyst for change came in 1853 with the arrival of Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy. Imagine 4 black ships belching smoke sailing into Edo Bay, their cannons menacingly trained on the capital. These were steam-powered warships, unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. Perry's mission, authorized by the US government, was clear: force Japan to open its ports to trade and establish diplomatic relations. He carried a letter from the US president and was prepared to use force if necessary. You can almost feel the collective shock and awe among the Japanese as these black ships appeared, a stark symbol of the technological gap that had developed during their centuries of isolation. Perry delivered the president's letter, stating he would return for an answer the following year, giving the shogunate time to consider. This arrival plunged the Tokugawa government into an unprecedented crisis. They had no effective navy to counter Perry's powerful ships, and their traditional defenses were utterly inadequate. The debate within the shogunate and among the daimyo was fierce and agonizing. Should they resist and risk a devastating war with a technologically superior power, or concede and compromise their long-held policy of isolation? When Perry returned in 1854 with an even larger fleet, the shogunate, realizing the futility of resistance, reluctantly signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. This treaty, though limited, opened 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, for American ships to take on supplies, provided for the humane treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and allowed a US consul to reside in Japan. This was the thin end of the wedge, and soon other Western powers, Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands, followed suit, demanding and receiving similar and often more extensive trade agreements. These were the unequal treaties, which granted extraterritoriality to foreigners, meaning they were subject to their own laws, not Japanese law, and fixed low import duties, severely limiting Japan's economic sovereignty. The signing of these treaties caused immense upheaval and ignited a powerful wave of nationalist and anti-foreign sentiment across Japan. The shogunate was perceived by many, particularly the disgruntled samurai and imperial loyalists as having betrayed Japan's sovereignty and shown weakness in the face of foreign demands. This led to the rallying cry of Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, which became a powerful slogan for those who sought to overthrow the Tokugawa. You see, the emperor in Kyoto, though a figurehead for centuries, now became a symbol of national unity and a rallying point for opposition to the shogunate. Young, ambitious samurai from powerful outer domains, particularly Choshu and Satsuma, in Western Japan, historically less under Tokugawa control, began to take the lead in this anti-shogunate, anti-foreign movement. These were the very samurai who for generations had been largely kept in check by Tokugawa policies like Sankin-kotai. They now saw an opportunity to overturn the established order. The internal political landscape became increasingly volatile. Assassinations of shogunate officials and foreigners became common, further escalating tensions. The shogunate, caught between powerful foreign demands and growing domestic opposition, found itself in an impossible position. It tried to appease both sides, but ultimately satisfied neither. Historians still argue whether the Tokugawa shogunate could have reformed itself to adapt to the new global reality, or if its rigid structure made its collapse inevitable once external pressure became overwhelming. The pressure mounted both from within and without. The samurai, whose purpose had been blurred by 2 centuries of peace, now found a new, albeit chaotic, purpose: to expel the barbarians and revere the emperor. The long peace was unequivocally shattered, not by internal feuds, but by the irresistible force of global change. Japan was about to embark on its most radical transformation yet, a revolution driven by a complex mix of fear, ambition, and a desperate desire to modernize and stand equal with the Western powers. The stage was set for the dramatic end of the samurai era and the dawn of a new Japan. The pressure from the West, embodied by Perry's black ships, cracked open Japan's isolation and exposed the deep fault lines within the Tokugawa shogunate. The Sono Joy movement, fueled by a potent mix of anti-foreign sentiment and reverence for the emperor, rapidly gained momentum, pulling Japan into its final transformative conflict. You are now at the threshold of the Meiji Restoration. The dramatic overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rapid modernization of Japan that fundamentally ended the age of the samurai. The leading forces behind this revolution were ambitious young samurai from the powerful Western domains of Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen, often collectively known as the Sacho-Tosa-Hizen alliance. These domains had historically been less loyal to the Tokugawa and now saw an opportunity to establish a new order. They recognized that expelling the barbarians in a literal sense was impossible, given Western technological superiority. Instead, they cleverly adapted the slogan: to truly expel the barbarians, Japan first needed to become like the barbarians, strong, technologically advanced, and unified. This meant overthrowing the weak shogunate and restoring the emperor to real power. The movement gained significant traction, drawing in impoverished samurai, anti-shogunate daimyo, and even some court nobles. They saw the shogunate's inability to repel foreign incursions as proof of its illegitimacy and weakness. The slogan, "Revere the Emperor," expel the barbarians, thus became a rallying cry for radical change, not just a return to old ways. The conflict escalated into a full-blown civil war, known as the Boshin War, 1868-1869. Initially, the shogunate, with its traditional forces, seemed formidable. However, the imperial loyalists, particularly those from Choshu and Satsuma, had secretly acquired modern Western firearms and training. Their armies, though smaller, were often better equipped and more strategically led, thanks to the tactical brilliance of figures like Saigo Takamori from Satsuma and Kido Takayoshi from Choshu. Imagine samurai, clad in traditional armor, fighting with modern rifles, a truly surreal blend of old and new. In late 1867, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, attempting to avoid further bloodshed and a complete collapse, formally resigned his position and returned political power to the emperor. This act, known as Taisei Hokan, return of great political authority, was meant to preserve the Tokugawa's influence in a new consultative government. However, the imperial loyalists, sensing total victory, refused to allow the Tokugawa to retain any significant power. They declared an imperial restoration in January 1868, completely abolishing the shogunate and stripping the Tokugawa clan of their vast land holdings. This pushed Yoshinobu and his supporters to resist, leading to the full outbreak of the Boshin War. The fighting was relatively short but decisive. Key battles, like the Battle of Toba-Fushimi near Kyoto, saw the shogunate's forces relying on traditional samurai and outdated tactics, utterly defeated by the smaller but technologically superior imperial forces. The fighting then spread north, with loyalist forces slowly crushing remaining Tokugawa resistance. By mid-1869, the last holdouts were defeated, signaling the end of the Tokugawa rule that had lasted for over 260 years. The Meiji Restoration, named after the new Emperor Meiji, was far more than just a change of government. It was a revolution from above, a frantic scramble to modernize Japan and avoid the fate of other Asian nations that had fallen under Western colonial domination. The new Meiji government immediately embarked on a series of radical reforms aimed at transforming Japan into a modern industrial and military power. The most profound change, and the one that directly impacted you, the samurai, was the abolition of the samurai class itself. In 1871, the old feudal domains were replaced by a centralized prefectural system. Then, in 1873, a national conscript army was established, effectively ending the samurai's monopoly on military service. Finally, in 1876, the edict forbidding the wearing of swords in public was issued, a symbolic and practical blow to the samurai's identity. Their fixed stipends were converted into government bonds, which often led to financial hardship for many. You, as a samurai, were suddenly stripped of your hereditary status, your right to carry a sword, and your guaranteed income. It was an identity crisis of epic proportions. Many samurai adapted, finding new roles in the burgeoning bureaucracy, military, or emerging industries. Some, however, unable to reconcile with this dramatic shift, resisted. The most famous resistance was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the very heroes of the Restoration. Saigo, a conservative samurai who felt the pace of modernization was too rapid and that the spirit of the samurai was being lost, led a large traditional samurai army against the new imperial conscript army. It was a final, desperate, and ultimately doomed stand of the old ways against the inexorable march of modernity. Saigo and his remaining loyal samurai were annihilated at the Battle of Shiroyama. Historians still argue whether Saigo Takamori was a tragic hero fighting for lost ideals, or a stubborn reactionary clinging to a dying world. The Meiji Restoration achieved its goal. Japan rapidly industrialized, built a modern military, and began to assert itself on the world stage. But it did so at the cost of centuries of tradition and the complete dismantling of the samurai class, the warrior who had once been the undisputed ruler, the moral compass, and the armed protector of Japan, was now officially a relic of the past. Their story, however, was far from over. The final smoke from the Satsuma Rebellion has faded, and with it, the official institutionalized age of the samurai has drawn to a close. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan with breathtaking speed, creating a modern nation-state that would soon become a global power. But as you reflect on this sweeping narrative, from ancient clans to steamships and conscript armies, you realize that the samurai's lasting legacy is far more profound than simply a historical footnote. Their spirit, their values, and their stories continue to exert an undeniable influence on modern Japan, weaving themselves into the very fabric of its identity. Imagine the millions of Japanese citizens who for centuries had a samurai ancestor. That heritage didn't simply vanish with a decree. Many former samurai, particularly those from the educated elite, found new roles in the Meiji government, the nascent industries, and the rapidly modernizing military. They brought with them their traditions of discipline, loyalty, and service, albeit reoriented towards the emperor and the nation rather than a feudal lord. The very bureaucracy that governed modern Japan was often staffed by men whose grandfathers had worn swords. It's like a corporate merger where the old company's management team just takes over the new one, albeit in different uniforms. The ideals of Bushido, though no longer a practical guide for daily armed combat, were repurposed and reinterpreted for the modern age. Concepts like self-discipline, dedication to duty, loyalty to the nation, and the pursuit of excellence became cornerstones of the new imperial military and the emerging corporate culture. The stoicism and resilience often associated with the samurai found a new expression in the face of national challenges and the drive for industrialization. Historians still debate whether the reinvention of Bushido in the Meiji era was a genuine spiritual continuation or a convenient ideological tool used by the state to foster militarism and nationalism. Perhaps it was a potent combination of both, a shared cultural memory adapted for new purposes. You can see the aesthetic influence everywhere. The clean lines of traditional Japanese architecture, the precision of its craftsmanship, the minimalist beauty of its gardens, all subtly reflect a sensibility fostered during the long centuries of samurai rule. Even the art forms that flourished during the Edo period, like ukiyo-e, captured a fleeting world that the samurai, directly or indirectly, shaped. The very structure of Japanese society, with its emphasis on hierarchy, group harmony, and respect for authority, bears the imprints of the long feudal era. The image of the samurai, iconic and powerful, continued to captivate the Japanese imagination, and indeed, the world. Films, novels, and popular culture endlessly explored their stories, often romanticizing their honor and bravery. From Akira Kurosawa's cinematic masterpieces to modern manga and anime, the samurai remain a potent symbol of Japanese identity, embodying a complex mix of chivalry, tragedy, and martial prowess. This enduring fascination speaks to the profound impact they had on the collective psyche. However, it's also important to acknowledge the darker aspects of their legacy. The rigid social hierarchy, the unquestioning loyalty to authority, and the emphasis on militarism that characterized parts of the samurai era while providing stability, also laid some groundwork for later expansionist and ultra-nationalist movements in the 20th century. The idea of the samurai's unyielding spirit was sometimes twisted to justify aggressive military actions. It's a complex legacy with both light and shadow, much like any deep historical influence. Even today, you'll find subtle echoes. The dedication of Japanese workers to their companies, the emphasis on quality and precision in manufacturing, the respect for elders and tradition. Many argue these traits have roots in the disciplined hierarchical society shaped by the samurai. While you won't see swords being worn on the streets of Tokyo, the influence of that long and complex warrior history remains palpable, a quiet hum beneath the surface of modern life. So as you drift off, remember the journey you've taken, from the tribal beginnings, through the elegant court, to the rise of the ruthless warlords, the epic battles, the long peace of Edo, and finally, the dramatic push into modernity. The samurai were not just warriors. They were administrators, poets, philosophers, and ultimately, the architects of a unique cultural identity. Their story is a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the enduring power of ideals, even when those ideals are challenged by a changing world. And now the journey through the history of the samurai and feudal Japan draws to a close. The clang of steel, the rustle of silk, the whisper of ancient trees, they all fade into the quiet night. Let the images settle gently in your mind, like the last embers of a campfire. You've explored a world of honor and ambition, conflict and peace, tradition and transformation. The moon hangs high, casting long, soft shadows, and the world outside is still and calm. Rest now, your mind filled with the echoes of a remarkable past.